Hello, world. So, today, in honor of Blackout Tuesday, while we're listening to black voices and trying to learn from them, I, as a black male, want to tell you a little bit of a story. My hope and my effort is that by telling this story, it'll hopefully teach you something about our current circumstances and what I believe might be lying for us in our near future. And hopefully, we can learn from it and avoid those worst case scenarios. Now, its plot points will actually seem somewhat familiar. You've probably seen them before, either in our story or in stories like it. But in a bit of a fun twist, much like those executive offices in the music industry who pitch this current activism, let's actually just take all the black out of the story. Now, this is actually a story that conservatives love to tote. They love to talk about it and remind black people whenever slavery is mentioned, so I figured we should look a little bit more into it, a little more closely, and we can finally see the case for why police should be severely defunded. Now, I just want to get one thing out of the way. I am a fairly progressive person. I like to think of myself as as progressive or more progressive than most people. But completely defunding the police is a bit of a bridge too far for me. Now, literally only because there is legitimate shit that does go bump in the night. Like, we don't have to go on the dark web to know. We just know there are bad people on Earth. And although I'm not personally afraid for my own well-being, except around cops, and don't worry, we will get back to that, there are people who have legitimate concerns and worries, and there are people who do bad things. So at the end of the day, we do need to have police available to track these people down and bring them to justice. The problem is, that's not what they're currently doing, and I believe that's why we've taken to the streets. Now, like I said, I wanted to do my own little twist on the blackout by removing the black from the story. Because right now, yes, the issue is on police brutality as it relates to African Americans in the United States. But that's not actually the full extent of the issue. This is really a societally consistent issue. Policing. And it doesn't matter where you live. If you live in a place with a marginalized minority, the police were likely created with the sole intention to suppress and control that minority. Now, this is a very different conversation because, yes, police brutality in the U.S. is critically important and it's something we need to address. And to be honest, as a Canadian, I'm grateful every day I'm not south of the 49th parallel. But we have our own issues here. And again, the police are utilized for that exact same function. Here, they're just as likely to come up to you if you're in the wrong neighborhood or out of the wrong event. Or there's always those restrictions put on black entries at certain venues downtown Toronto. Now, we're not perfect, but again, the police are utilized to enforce that physical control and that access to public space. Now, what does that control actually look like? Well, very simply, if you're denied entry into a club for sneakers, while a white guy walks past you with sandals on, if you raise your voice a little too high, you might end up spending a night in prison. And this is something that me, my brothers and sisters, and black people across the country just kind of know to be true. So if you're currently saying, we're Canadian and we're better than that, I want to let you know, yeah, we don't necessarily have cops killing black people as often as the Americans do on the streets, but trust me on this, we have our own issues. Now, sorry for that side note, because that's it right there. We don't really have to talk about one particular case, because that's why I'm kind of taking race out of it, to highlight the actions and the contributions of police themselves, their role and their function. Because when you look at just their function, you start to realize how universal it really is. So yeah, in the States, you'll have police killing black men on the streets. But what that really is the mix of the function of suppression and control with a clear visual cue. You fit the description. And the clearance of the state to utilize any amount of violence they want. Start looting, start shooting. And this becomes the obvious outcome. It's not so much that racism leads to police killing black men. Racism has a number of offshoots and a number of causes and a number of symptoms. What this really becomes is the problem of policing in the context of a racist society. And those are two different things. They do play one into the next, but you can start to pull them out and start to see how they apply in other places. Because, for example, when you take race out of it and you look out of the American context, you start to appreciate why Black Lives Matter activists and the organizers in Hong Kong should probably be in a group chat daily. Because they're actually fighting a common enemy. Each of those states wishes to control that population. to remove their right to assembly, to constrict their rights, to impress upon them a regime which is fundamentally opposed to their well-being, and in the case of America, in opposition to their life. But again, this is why I say take race out of it. Because instead of you speaking on a case of just the Americas or just Canada or in individual cases, you can really start to appreciate what the function of policing is and why it may not be needed in our current society. Now, like I said, I wanted to take race out of this. So for this little lesson, this little story, I actually want to talk about the Irish. Now, I know what you're thinking. The Irish? Yeah, I literally want to take this time to speak about an issue about policing with no black people in it. Because let's be honest, how many times have we seen that it takes a personal impact for white people to change? Sorry, not sorry. So as we always have to do in our effort to explain our suffering, I'll translate it in a way that reflects people who look like you and how it's impacted them. So we'll talk about the Irish. And there's, to be fair, another reason I kind of wanted to discuss this story, and it's ironically actually a personal connection for me. So I'm a 6'6" black man with the last name Finnegan. Now, that could open up a whole nother lecture, but if you're curious of what that lecture might be, I'll just leave you with a simple question. Why is it ironic that Marchand has the last name Lynch? Very simple question. Why is it ironic that Marchand has the last name Lynch? But moving on. My last name is Finnegan, and as you can imagine, that had always been its own list of jokes that I'd survived my entire life growing up. Whether it was, there was a man named Michael Finnegan, or, which, to be fair, was innocuous. But, you know what I mean? I remember my high school football coach one time, when he heard, years later, after I'd been on the team for a while, he was like, when you first came to sign up, I didn't really believe you, because, let's be honest, a huge black guy with the last name Finnegan. But then I stopped and thought to myself and said, well, what, am I going to not let this guy play football? And, I love that coach. He's great. We are really close, great dude. But in that moment, it just reminded me that my value is inherently tied to my size, just as a small note. Just one of those things that we live with. But either way, the best incarnation of my last name actually happened when I went to Northern Ireland. I spent weeks there getting to know the population and winning a lot of free beer, to be honest, by betting who had a more Irish name. It's hilarious. For those who don't know, Finnegan's Wake is likely the most famous piece of Irish literature, so needless to say, it was a lot of free Guinness. That said, I was taken in by them, but regardless. And I mean, I was really taken in as one of their own. It was amazing and really an incredibly warm reception. The more I traveled, I also seemed to notice something, though. It was really that they really reflected with the struggle. And the more I looked, I noticed something else. There were Palestinian flags everywhere, and shop windows painted on the end of row houses. And at first it struck me as kind of strange, but as this was a school trip and I learned a little bit about their history before going over, I gave it a little bit of thought and it did make sense. These people had been persecuted, and as such, they related to people who had also been through persecution. It was why they welcomed me so quickly and so easily, and it was why there were Palestinian flags all over the place. So, with that in mind, that was the reason I kind of wanted to tell you this story. Because I wanted to tell you the story and show you the parallels, and why above all else, it's time for two things. One, the cooperation among international revolutionary movements, because we're all trying to do the same thing, and we're all in a very similar fight. And I think the Irish story will show you the parallels. But then also it will show you a little bit about policing, just policing, and how it can be implemented. Not among black people, not among a racist society, nothing. Just policing, and how policing can be used to really control a minority group. So yeah, as I mentioned, this story, the current story, begins in 1916. But depending on who you ask, it either started in the 12th century and led to some orange guy on a wall 400 years later, or you ask another set and it started even earlier with some guy cut his hand off to win a boat race. Theology is weird. Let's just leave it there. But either way, the current iteration started in 1916. Up until this point, the Irish had been living as second-class citizens within a united British kingdom. This included the fact that if an Irish wanted to get fare to the US or Canada, which they often did, potato famine and all, they had the option to sell themselves into indentured servitude for 7 years, which is why I mentioned earlier that conservatives love to bring this up, the plight of the Irish in relation to slavery, because somehow they see these two things as equivalent, but we'll leave that alone for now. But at this point, in 1916, they were a lesser state to the English. So, for example, the Titanic, a British luxury ocean liner, was actually built in Belfast, Ireland, but by a British company in a British part of town by mainly British workers. A note, I'm also aware of the multitude of identities within all parts of both the Republic and the North. Like I said, I've been there. I have friends there. I try to understand it. And by no means is this an attempt to like cram them into boxes when I say British or Irish or this or that or the other. However, for simplicity's sake, I will be using the terms British and Irish, as at the times that's likely how they would have identified themselves along the list of like 19 other identifiers. Also, just as a note, like I don't have enough time to really go into all of this, so I will be skipping over a number of social and economic trends that honestly also really closely align with the Black experience in America. But like I said, right now we're just talking about police, but I do highly recommend, if you're curious or if you're like, I wonder if this guy's just making all this shit up, like go do your own research. But yeah, like I said, we're just going to be talking about policing, so back to that. Now, like I said, 1916. So in 1916, during Easter week, a band of Irish nationalists, along with about 1,600 followers, staged a rebellion. They seized the buildings throughout Dublin, and over the next week, they fought with the British Army stationed there, eventually being suppressed after about 2,000 people were dead or injured. Now, these people rose up after years, honestly years, of fighting for moderate solutions in a joint parliament in UK. The nation initially had favored some home rule, as in they wanted to be able to decide some policies, but they were willing to stay within a united UK. And after that had been shot down almost about a dozen times, eventually a small faction became more radicalized and saw that moderate solutions would never be implemented anyway, and to be honest, they might never be enough. So then, this group of people came together to start to advocate for complete independence. And when this group came together and became strong enough over that Easter week, they struck out and tried to attain that independence. Now, this group did inevitably fail. However, in the fallout, like I said, originally, most of the nation had been for home rule. And even when they struck out for independence, most of the nation wasn't even behind them. But in the fallout, as the uprising leaders were killed, they were turned into martyrs. And as the information permeated throughout and information disseminated, popular opinion swung, and in the next election, Sinn Féin, an independence party, won major electoral victories, and actually refused to sit in parliament demanding independence. Now this led to a bit of a referendum, and this is where that majority British part of the city comes into play, because independence won in 26 of 32 counties. And although they had a clear majority, the solution that they came to was to cut off those 6 counties and create the county of Northern Ireland. And that's where it started from. Now, it's kind of interesting because there are a couple of corollaries in this that I just want to point out to the current world we're in today. One, when you kill a leader, you risk yourself turning him into a martyr. I just wanted to point that out for a lot of, let's just say for Donald Trump and anybody who is currently saying when you start looting, you start shooting, because you are very, 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 very quickly going to turn public opinion against yourself. Just as a note. Now, I don't want to talk about today, though. I do want to talk about what was going on concurrently at the time in the United States, because it's important. Because for anybody, and as I said, one of the things is the cooperation among international movements. The reason I state this is because if you think that states and police actors are not currently cooperating, yeah, you're an idiot. So let's just talk about what was going on concurrently in the United States at that time. Because at that point in time in the States, that was when they were burning down Tulsa and black newspapers in North Carolina and really all across the country. Now, the reason I highlight that is because at that same time, while they were putting down uprisings in the US, and they had a current uprising in the UK, and as former slave patrols were being retrofitted to become sheriff departments, the Royal Irish Constabulary, which at that time had already been known for police brutality in various uprisings and wars for independence that had preceded the Easter Rising, Once again, it's never the first one that breaks the system. There were a number of uprisings that had come before this, but there's always the one that breaks the back. But beside the point, in the fallout and in the wake of independence and after the partition of the country, the IRC, Royal Irish Constabulary, was reformed to become the Royal Ulster Constabulary. This force was tasked not only with protecting the people, but also enforcing internal order and the new Northern Ireland entity, which at that time faced considerable opposition. Now, I would just like to highlight, once again, another corollary. The addition of the enforcement of internal order is always something you should be wary of. Anytime the police go from protect and serve to enforce order, be concerned. Cool. Now, this opposition, like I said, to the Northern Ireland state it came darned. And much like we see today, the police often enacted disproportionate responses to any attack on police. So, for example, on multiple times, they would kill multiple Irish citizens, 10 plus sometimes, in response to a single officer's death. And surprise, surprise, no convictions were ever had for any of the killings on either side. And another note, and this is actually something important, and it's going to seem slightly tangential, because anybody watch Peaky Blinders? Peaky Blinders, anybody? Great show. Well, if you do, and you haven't seen the end of season 2 yet, spoiler alert for one, but also, where have you been? Catch up. Either way, I just want to cast you back in mind to the end of season 2, because there is a critically important lesson to learn there. So let's just go over what was happening. So at that point in time in the season, Tommy Shelby, everyone's favorite depressive maniac, was about to be killed. And who wanted him dead? Major Campbell. Now, Major Campbell was a police officer and a detective who had been come to put down the kind of gang violence in the area. And he identified that Tommy was the source of it and thus wanted him dead. Now, Major Campbell, being a police officer, obviously couldn't kill somebody. They weren't in the United States at that point in time. But he knew of people who could. So who did he call? He called the Ulster Volunteer Forces. And what was interesting was he called his old friends to kidnap Tommy and kill him, and then only to have one of them let him go with a message from who? Winston Churchill. Now, like I said, it might seem superficial or tangential because it's from a TV show, and I don't think Tommy Shelby was real. I haven't looked into the history of Peaky Blinders, but I'm fairly certain it's a drama. But nonetheless, that construct existed. And it's very instructive because, well, let's look at who those people were and the relationship that's highlighted in this interaction. First off, you have the Ulster Volunteer Forces, the precursor to the Ulster Volunteers, the precursor to the Ulster Volunteer Force. Now, this was a voluntary militia force in Northern Ireland that is proven to have numerous violent attacks to their record. The one that pops to mind always was the time they attacked a funeral and threw grenades into the casket, but that's a whole other story, and it only pops to mind because I had somebody who was there tell me it, but that's a whole other story. But either way, they were the precursors. And who are they interacting with? Oh yeah, that's right, the police. And who are they translating messages for? That's right, the state. Now, I just want to highlight that interaction. Because, for example, if I were to tell you that there are currently members of the KKK in the police force, you'd probably call me crazy. And yet, we have this exact corollary, which has been proven in history. And we've seen the historical records in America of the KKK influencing and being a part of police forces at their outset. And yet somehow people will be like, no, that couldn't happen. Could it? Well, if you believe that, I have a house in Michigan that belonged to a former police officer to sell you. Don't worry, a Google search will tell you what I'm talking about. But either way, are you starting to see it yet? Are you starting to see where these alignments start to come? Are you starting to see where the patterns are? No? Alright, fine. We'll skip ahead a little bit. I have essentially just 3 more stories to tell you. The first is of Bloody Sunday. To get there, we're going to skip ahead a little bit because, like most revolutionary movements, it lost a little bit of steam in the 1920s. So the revolution happened. They get a separated state. The Ulster Volunteer Forces come out. IRA's out. And by about 1928, 29, the recession hits. World War II starts to come around. And everything kind of settles down for the next little bit. Until about the 1960s, when, like everywhere else in the world, shit kind of hit the fan. So, what started it? Well, first, like the United States, it was discrimination. So the clearest example of this was the single mother of four who would have to wait months on months on months for public housing, while a single male British Protestant would be able to get housing immediately. Why? Familial ties, and just plain out discrimination. And this was apparent everywhere throughout society and everywhere throughout the economy. And inevitably, eventually, the camel's back broke and, uprising began again. Now, it's important to look at this because at the outset, the violence was not supported. It was there. I'm not going to say it wasn't. But it was not widely supported. Most of the protesters at the time had actually started to model themselves off of the nonviolent movement in the U.S., modeling themselves after Martin Luther King Jr., and having peaceful protest. But do you know what broke that? I'll give you a guess. I'll give you a hint, too. There's a U2 song about it. Sunday, Bloody Sunday. Yep, Sunday, Bloody Sunday. So in response to protest of incarceration and internment without trial, what did the Royal Ulster Constabulary do? They shot and killed 20 plus people. Yep. Sound familiar? And then what happened? Violence became the norm. And I just wanted to stop to just sit here for a second, because I really implore you to go back and do a little bit of research on this, because this is the timeline. There is uprising, that uprising is put down, and any content under pressure will burst. This is not a threat, it is a law of thermodynamics. So when you send your police force out to tamper, and to do so violently, every single case in history tells you it gets worse. It never gets better. It never gets better. It always gets worse. And then there's also a second part of this. Because what were they protesting against? Internment without trial. Why were they doing this? Well, because at the point in time where they were, the Ulster Volunteer Forces would be feeding fake information to the police, and they would be arresting basically any male in the community. And I mean almost any male. At some points in times, the majority of men in the community would be in prison. Now, it's kind of interesting because as, black men, that's unfortunately been the majority of our existence in North America. But I just want to take one more note out, because I want to tell you the story of Bobby Sands. And I want to tell you the story of the IRA and how they formed, and how they became, and how Sinn Féin and how Bobby Sands and men like him became political leaders. Because as they were in turn, they took that time to organize, to read, to study, to plot, to plan. And as Killer Mike would say, I believe it's plan, strategize, mobilize, organize. I can't remember all of them, but that list is amazing. Shouts out Killer Mike. But that is what they did for decades. Now, the reason I highlight the story of Bobby Sands is because I want you guys to appreciate, as the protests are going, you are creating leaders in the streets right now. And it's amazing, because everyone thinks there's melee. Everyone feels like, oh, no, it's just, helter-skelter. Nope. You're crafting leaders right now, because Bobby Sands was out there. The man died at 27 on a hunger strike, in prison as an elected member of parliament. The British did that. They made him a martyr. He didn't do it himself, because you can't do it in the face of no opposition. You can only do it in the face of opposition. So just note that. You're currently creating leaders, and I'm glad for it, to be honest, because let's be honest, I wouldn't be making this and encouraging you to do this research if we weren't in the climate we're currently in. Now, the last story I want to tell you because honestly, this thing's running up to about half an hour, and I just want to kind of wrap up at this point. The last story I want to tell you is one that got told to me while I was in Ireland, and it taught me a very important lesson. So it's the story of a good friend of mine, Evelyn Glenn Holmes. So Evelyn was, let's just say, involved in the struggle. And at that later time, how most women were involved, they would be building bombs. Not to say that she was, but she was suspected to be. And needless to say, she left Northern Ireland. For a while, they believed she was, in Cuba. She was in, she was out with Che Guevara. She was with wherever. Where was she? Dublin. My single favorite story, because basically, just remember, the cops are usually idiots. They're like, oh, she's in Latin America. No, she's like 500 clicks from you. But when they finally found her in Dublin, there was one issue. It's a separate state, so they had to get extradition papers. And Good Friday comes. They bring her into court, which, just to let you know how crazy it was, they brought her into court on Good Friday in Ireland. If you're Irish, you know how crazy that is. They brought her into court, and she ends up getting let go. Why? They spelled her name wrong. Now, this is very important, and this is the reason why I want to tell you this is what it taught me. Black people, learn your names. Malcolm had to go by X because he didn't know what to use. Black people, learn your history. Understand, again, why is it ironic that Marshawn's last name is Lynch? Why is it hilarious that my last name's Finnegan? What are our histories? Because I'll tell you this. On that day, when she looked at the judge and explained to him that the spelling of her name was actually Gaelic, and the way she spelt it was not the way that was on the form, you know what they had to do? They let her go. Know your name. Know who you are. At this time, in this point in history, do your research, because I'm telling you right now, the knowledge you gain from a sense of self is incredible. And I can't explain it to you. And it's weird because I learned it there. And this is just a super side note. Because they're playing their own games. They're playing hurling. They're speaking their own language. They're starting to write their language again. And this is a language that had been nearly lost. So please, black people, please, let us learn our history. But yes, so in summation, like I said, I didn't want to take up too much of your time, but I just want to highlight policing versus policing in a racist state. Policing is used to control. Policing is used to suppress. Policing is used, and in every case in history, these are the functions of policing. And if you are a minority population in a majority country, it is used all the more. And then they will also usually partner up with extrajudicial groups outside of it and have informants on both sides. Like, these stories have been repeated throughout history. This is why when we look around and say, yo, watch for the op, watch for this, watch for that, these aren't things we're discovering. We all know what COINTELPRO is. You just don't. We do. Yeah, Google that too. We know this history. So on today, as we sit out and we black out, I just wanted to take that time to tell you the story of policing in a state with no color. Because it doesn't matter whether it's Hong Kong, whether it's France, when the yellow vests are out protesting, whether it's America, whether it's Canada, whether it's Occupy Wall Street or the Arab Spring. It's all the same. All of it. They're there to control and suppress. Just know that. Alright, this is my message for today. I hope to God you got something from it. Maybe it made you consider something differently. Maybe it gave you inspiration to research something else. But I hope to God, if anything, it taught you that, you know what? Policing isn't what you always thought it was. And if the current circumstances haven't shown you that, to be honest, I doubt this did. But I wish you well. I wish us all, I was going to say peace in this time, but I don't think peace is what we need anymore. I wish you change, and I wish you prosperity, and I wish you growth. And none of those things come easy.